Good afternoon. My name is Lucan. I am professor of political science at the University of Toronto and co-director of the Petro Jacyk program for the study of Ukraine. Right now, I believe it is that we've been in this war for 124 days. This is, in my view, kind of a new stage of the conflict. We're beyond. I mean, the Ukrainians have shown themselves to have the capacity to beat back the Russian aggressors, a much larger army. But it also raises a lot of new challenges in regards to kind of Ukraine fatigue. So today we're going to discuss basically kind of where things stand in the war. We have two experts, Maria Popova, and hopefully Oxana Shevel, who will join us. She's apparently having some computer issues, so hopefully she will come on with us shortly. But let me just first introduce Maria Popova is John Monnet Chair and Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University. Her work explores the intersection of politics and law in the post-communist region and the legal repression of dissent. She has a book from 2012, Politicized Justice in Emerging Democracies, published by Cambridge, and that won the American Association for Ukrainian Studies Prize for Best Book in the fields of Ukrainian history, politics, language, literature, and culture. And I see you're also, thankfully, joined by Oxana, who has resolved her computer issues. Professor Shevel, her research focuses on the post-communist region surrounding Russia, issues of nation and state building, and the politics of citizenship and migration, memory, and religious politics. Her book, published by Cambridge University in 2011, Migration, Refugee Policy, and State Building in Post-Communist Europe. He also won the American Association of Ukrainian Studies Book Prize. Did you guys win the same prize?
Same prize, different years, yes.
Okay, it was like... Professor Shevel and Professor Popova have both run on Ukraine. I just discovered won the same prize. And they're also, I think, my rumor has it they're also writing a book together on this conflict. So I just want to get right into it. I think before we begin sort of a general discussion of where things stand, I think we need to sort of talk about Kremenchuk. And get your initial reactions, but also kind of try to understand sort of, maybe sort of get what could possibly motivate Russia to do this kind of thing in a way that doesn't seem to sort of fulfill any kind of military or tactical or strategic objective. So maybe start with you, Maria, and go to you, Oksana.
So my sense is that this is probably Russia lashing out and saying, the whole world is against us. So we are going to inflict maximum destruction and terrorize this population that has now resisted our liberation for over 4 months. And some journalists actually called me in the last couple of days asking, is there a connection to the G7 meeting? And I mean, you can connect it. Russia has been doing these things all along. You can connect it to the G7. You can connect it to the candidacy status that Ukraine got from the EU. But I think it's not necessarily a direct connection, but sort of an indirect signal that Russia is sending that they're not ready to negotiate a peace deal here. They're continuing, and their goal remains not just Eastern Ukraine, but all of Ukraine, and that's why we see these attacks, in Kyiv again, and in the center in Kremenchuk.
Yeah, Oksana, do you want to?
Yeah, I agree with what Maria said. I just add maybe like 2 points. One, I think it is definitely a way to terrorize the population. So we just today heard, I think Peskov was saying that Ukraine can end the war in one day if it just capitulated, right? So these sorts of indiscriminate terror attacks that nobody's safe, anybody can be a victim, right? You have multiple deaths. I mean, that could be part of kind of breaking the will to resist, right? I think, and of course, Putin has no moral scruples over doing this. I think another thing that might be part of the kind of broader picture, that they live, I mean, in Russia, I mean, it seems like which almost is like a parallel reality, right? And there could be, at least for domestic consumption, certainly a narrative made, as we had seen from M17, right, to all sorts of things, how it's not really what it looks. Some Russian Telegram channels already saying that, the dead bodies were brought in there, or there was like military, weaponry stored in there, all sorts of things, right? So I think there is also this arrogance that we can basically get away with it, at least for part of the audience, both domestically and actually globally, because there are all this, tankies and people in different countries who will be like, oh, well, maybe that's something to it, and so forth, right? And the third thing, I think it's also maybe part to think about it, is that I think we should take seriously those people who have studied post-Soviet culture and kind of how people who grew up in certain environments think. It's sort of, and Putin, having grown up in the streets of Leningrad when he said you punch first sort of thing, right? Like might is right. I mean, this is really something that I think for civilized world is hard to comprehend for people in civilized world that we are used to negotiating and compromising and sort of talking through our differences. But he kind of acts thuggish in this way, right? And yes, he's a state leader, but he's also the person that, he grew up. I mean, I don't want to psychoanalyze him, but I think this is something that when you say, like, how can you understand this? It makes absolutely no sense. It made sense in that sort of street fight, like, I punch you harder, I punch you first, and then you fold, even if, you may have like a better position if we discuss it intellectually or so forth, right? So I think that's another thing to keep in mind.
Right. No, I think absolutely. I mean, it makes sense in terms of, definitely reflects the kind of behavior of a power that is either unaware or doesn't want to be aware of its impact in the broader world, and seems completely
or is aware, but thinks that it can sort of shape the impact, right? And even if the world doesn't like it, that's still how you get it. Like it's sign of weakness if you don't display strengths, right? So that's sort of, we're talking about how can we compromise and find the middle path, but that's maybe not at all how Putin thinks.
Yeah, and we absolutely agree with Maria. It definitely indicates that there's no desire to negotiate at this point, but we didn't really need any more evidence of that, but I think that's definitely comes in. So I think I now want to sort of go to the sort of I'm going to start with sort of the kind of general state of the military conflict. I mean, I think we've obviously had sort of losses in Severodonetsk, but then there's also been at least some optimistic sort of news from the south in terms of perhaps retaking Kherson. So I just maybe each of you could take a crack at sort of kind of providing a sense of where we are sort of in terms of the militarily right now. In terms of, I mean, are we sort of, is this sort of the beginnings of a kind of are the kind of borders, so to speak, the military, front line kind of hardening right now, and the like? Maybe start with you, Maria.
Sure. So it seems to me that militarily things are progressing very slowly, and it's really hard to say in any way whether Russia is slowly gaining or Ukraine is slowly pushing back. I mean, it's basically stalled because there are parts in the east where Russia is advancing and parts in the south where Ukraine potentially could regain some territory. But to me, it's worrisome from the last few days. Sort of more reports about potentially Russia again trying to mobilize from Belarus and again attack the north, attack Kharkiv. So that's definitely concerning. So basically it's a stalemate and a war of attrition. That's what it looks like to me.
Yeah, Oksana?
Yeah, I think, none of us being military specialists, there are a lot of things we don't know, right? And I think kind of the big unknown, and this really factors in the debate, at least the way I've seen it unfold in the media, is like, is Ukraine potentially more exhausted, right? In other words, let's put it this way. There are two ways, I think, to look at the military prospects, right? Like one would say, look, Russia has more weaponry, like the, less precise weaponry. It has many people, and it can basically grind down Ukraine, right? Like, yes, like they haven't gained that much. They've been trying to take Severodonetsk, I think, since the middle of March, right? So it is very slow progress. And yes, they're losing a lot of people. But over time, right, just by sheer size and the number of people and the number of these old Soviet weaponry, they can grind Ukraine down, right? And add to it that they destroy, shopping centers and terrorize the population. And basically, Ukraine can't win and may as well settle, right? Like this is how this argument for capitulation essentially on the part of Ukraine goes, right? And then, of course, there is some wishful thinking that Putin will be satisfied with whatever he controls and we can go back to normal, right? Now, the other argument would basically say that, like, yes, like Russia does have all these advantages in manpower and so forth, but the whole world is helping Ukraine, right? Like it's getting more precise weaponry, it's getting heavier weaponry. It still is a very big country. We're not talking about some small state like Chechnya, right? That, Russia can just overpower. And basically time is on the side of Ukraine, right? And at some period of time, maybe by the end of the summer, maybe by early fall, when this heavy weaponry came in, when Ukrainians are trained in it, we will see the tide of war turning, right? Mm-hmm. And I think these are basically kind of two narratives out there now, as far as military sake, right? And not being military experts, I think it's hard to say which one is ultimately sort of would, prove to be more accurate. I mean, I am inclined to think that with the whole world helping Ukraine and, the morale is there, like that it will turn, the tide will turn towards Ukraine and Ukraine will eventually win. But it may take a really long time, right? It may be not just months, it could potentially be like years, right? I mean, this is also something that we had seen discussed, right? So I certainly don't think that this victory in Severodonetsk, to wrap up on this point, is some sort of like turning point, right? That Russia took it after they pounded it in session to the ground. But at the moment, right, like the short-term situation looks just like Maria is saying, right? There is a little bit of sort of gaining here, a little bit of gaining there. They now seem to be able to bomb Kharkiv more, but things are happening in the south, right? But I think broadly speaking, I think which one of these two narratives ultimately would be more supported with the evidence, right? Like how the war will end. I think this is something we will be looking out for.
Absolutely. I think the only thing I would add there is that, I think Russia has a very big population, but Putin doesn't necessarily want to have a general mobilization of the population because that brings it with its own costs. And we also,
exactly,
I think we don't know what the full impact of the sanctions are on weapons production. And I think so hopefully the West is testing that. And so I think there's a lot of unknowns ahead. And finally, I think the issue of kind of guerrilla warfare. I mean, this, even when Russia quote unquote controls territory, I think we're likely to see sort of guerrilla warfare, which we saw kind of the beginnings of in Kherson with a member of the Russian occupation government assassinated, and I mean I think we'll probably see that soon. Okay, so I just want to go to a topic which I think both of you have a bit more expertise, which is that sort of has to do with the recent announcement on Thursday that Ukraine would be a member of the, had candidacy for the European Union. And I just want to sort of kind of get your kind of reaction to the, first, I think maybe sort of get your reaction to the overall importance of this. At one level, it seems hugely important. At another level, you think Turkey, which I think became associate member or something like that in 1963 and began negotiations in 1987. So, looked at from that perspective, so how important is this? Maybe start with you, Oxana.
Yeah, I think it's hugely important. I think it's one of these rare historical moments when we can say the country was sort of at a crossroad, right? And like civilizational choice, I think comes, as an apt term to use. So I think it's very important that the signal was sent very clearly that Ukraine belongs in, European civilized world democratic family of nations and not in some sort of Russia-led arrangement or as a place in between, right, that cannot really be admitted, to Europe because it would upset Russia and so forth, right? And of course, yes, Russia has all sorts of issues with NATO, but I think we should keep in mind it was also not at all happy about prospects of EU association agreement, right? Like that's how Euromaidan starts. Putin started trade war against Yanukovych's Ukraine back in 2013, right? So that's clearly also, not just economic. But now, would it make a difference? I think the Turkey question here is interesting because basically now I would say the ball is in the court of Ukraine to a larger extent maybe than it was before. And I think it would be a great boost to all the anti-corruption and reformers within Ukraine, right? Because it's one thing that if you are say anti-corruption activists in a place, let's even bracket war for a minute, like how Ukraine was before the war, a lot of corruption, elites fighting for power, all of these, and you would be trying to push against it and say that's going to get us into Europe, right? We want to be European, but there was also this answer, oh, but Europe doesn't want us, right? This is all. Why should we go through these painful reforms, right? They don't want us anyway. So that argument no longer, I think, flies. And I think that would be a great boost to the civil society on all sorts of reforms, right? I think to keep elites in check and so forth. So overall, I see it as very positive, even though it may take a long time. And you're right. If, say, for whatever reason, Ukraine ended up with a government that, let's just imagine, it seems impossible to imagine, but some kind of pro-Russian government that no longer wanted to join the EU, right? And then they don't do anything. But then it's right. Then this offer of, the membership candidacy is just going to be kind of meaningless for that period of time that kind of government is in power, right? But I think overall it is still very positive, and I think we would see acceleration of all sorts of reforms in Ukraine, even already during the war. We already saw some of the reforms adopted that were not adopted before, and I think that will continue after the war.
That's a great point. So even if what you're saying is that, I've heard this before, that even if membership never comes, it's going to be an impetus reform that will have itself sort of.
I think so.
Beneficial impact. So maybe Maria, if you could sort of speak a little bit to sort of to the extent that you can, sort of what is it? I think we all sort of several weeks ago or months ago heard sort of Macron's comments about decades, before Ukrainian membership, and in general, the French political establishment has been quite kind of conservative on Ukraine, and do you think this reflects a shift in the sort of European attitude towards Ukraine, or are they kind of, well, alternatively, which occurred to me, and many of us, are they kind of, using this as a sop because they don't want to provide sort of weapons, or so? How would you interpret this from the sort of European side?
So I think it's definitely a watershed moment that candidacy was given, because in the last few months it was definitely not certainty. And I think it's definitely true that both France and Germany were pushed significantly to ultimately agree to this. France, wanted to provide this watered down kind of alternative. And Germany was also very lukewarm on the idea. So I think we're basically going to see this dynamic continue through this negotiation process, where Ukraine will have to prove its readiness over and over with reforms, and that for sure is great impetus for them to adopt all sorts of reforms, and they will have to constantly convince various constituencies within the EU, not just France and Germany, by the way. There's others, maybe smaller EU countries that were kind of hiding behind France and Germany's opposition, but were also maybe lukewarm on the entire prospect. So this will be a long-term process, but as Oksana said, it is good for Ukraine to be in that kind of give and take process, because they will have to step up reforms. And I think if they deliver on a lot of reforms, it'll just not be very easy for a conservative establishment within the EU to keep denying them, because the Turkish example is there, but it is very much, to a great extent, it's the fault of Turkey that they're in this position. If indeed a Turkish reformist government had, had adopted all the reforms, it would have been hard for the EU to keep denying. In fact, that's why it was so hard to get this candidate status, because there is a sense within the EU that once the enlargement process, the accession process ball starts rolling, it is actually not very easy to stop it. It gains momentum. It's a meritocratic process. So if the countries are showing progress, you have to move forward. I mean, there's also the example of the West Balkans, where they're also stuck, even though some of them have been showing progress, but they're stuck due to the Bulgarian veto right now. But before that, also France vetoed them or stopped them. So clearly it's a bumpy process, but that's precisely why we're talking now about the Western Balkans and how it's a travesty that they're stopped in their tracks. Because fundamentally it's a meritocratic process, and if you deliver, you have to get closer to it. So it's a big geopolitical decision by the EU to grant candidacy, and it puts Ukraine on a track where it can certainly eventually achieve membership.
Yeah, no, it's interesting raising the Balkans, because I mean that's an example like Ukraine where the decision to expand is really kind of related to security issues, right? I mean, it's a certain parallel there, although I hope that's, so I just, I think one sort of related issue has to do with corruption. I mean, it's interesting, I think we talked about this with you previously. I think before this war, the kind of stereotype of Ukraine was this sort of country racked by sort of oligarchs and, deeply corrupt, which, had certainly a certain element of truth. At the same time, there have been sort of, quite significant, reforms, since the first invasion in 2014. At the same time, we've seen, it's funny, interesting how sort of discussions of corruption kind of completely halted after February 24th. So I guess the question maybe for you, Oxana, is like, where do you see corruption now in Ukraine? I mean, how much of an issue is it still? Is this something that sort of is going to rear its head again, after Ukraine's victory, or is it kind of been something that has been more kind of permanently kind of dealt with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Maria, I'm sure will have more to say on the corruption, since that's what she studies more directly. Right. But I would say, like, just echoing something that you mentioned, I think it is important to keep in mind that I think Ukraine's kind of corruption problems sometimes have been exaggerated too much, right? Again, as you said, it's not the fact that there was no corruption or there was little corruption, but there were a lot of reforms and a lot of efforts, especially since 2014, right? Like anything from, institutional reform and the judiciary to the Prozoro, public procurement, to all sorts of other things, right, that were really important, were put in place, right, oftentimes, again, pushed by civil society activists against, quite some opposition from the power holders. So then, what would happen after the war? I mean, the way I look at it, first of all, I think the EU would be a great support, for the anti-corruption activists, as we already said. I think the EU acquis may also structure the specific reforms, right? Because if you are talking about closing these chapters or opening chapters for negotiation, right, they prescribe specific measures to be taken. So I think that may also kind of speed things up, because there is like a menu of things that you need to do. You don't need to sort of reinvent the wheel, right? But thirdly, I think it's also interesting to think about what impact will the war have, right? And the way I see it, I see kind of two possibilities. One basically is that there would be a lot less tolerance for corruption after the war, because people have suffered so much, right? Like any kind of corrupt elite that tries to enrich themselves at the expense of the people, there would be much, much less tolerated, right? So that's kind of would be the positive, we can say, side effect, maybe to some extent, right, of the war. But there is another possibility, or maybe both can happen at the same time. In Russian, there is this expression that says "Война всё спишет," which kind of means sort of like, how do you say that in English? Like war writes off everything, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And here, what I'm thinking that, and I'll give some example. I actually heard it informally from a colleague of mine who does volunteer work. in the in Kryvyi Rih region, where there is this guy Vilku in power, right? And he has, been in power for a long time. It's kind of well-known secret that there are these local networks that kind of controlled by him and so forth, right? And he has been sort of historically more pro-Russian politician who now became very much pro-Ukrainian. But according to this activist, this corruption network stayed in place, right? And the question is, like, are these elites such as, mayor of Odessa, right? Like mayor of Kharkiv, right? Vilku, may potentially other politicians who became patriotic, right? Could they use this, or could they try to use this as a way to say, like, we supported struggle against Russia, right? And give us a break, like, yes, maybe like some sort of shady business had gone on, but we were on the right side politically, right? And that overrides the corrupt, potentially, practices and so forth. So I can see, sort of both of these things potentially happening, or maybe even at the same time. And I think, again, the burden would be to large part on the civil society, on the local activists to uncover these, say, local corrupt practices, bring them to attention, and not let this narrative, like we were on the right side in the war, therefore we cannot be prosecuted for doing something, say, wrong with corruption, that shouldn't take hold after the war.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. I mean, I think you raise a good point about, if you look in the African context, a lot of the liberation regimes, their history in the liberation struggle becomes an excuse for corruption on the one side. At the same time, there's a phrase here that I've heard when Zelensky came to speak at Toronto, which is, things have to happen by the speed of war, right? That's the sense of, this is kind of obviously kind of doing away with all sorts of kind of structural obstacles that would in normal times prevent sort of corruption reform. Maria, this is obviously something you know intimately. What is your reaction?
So I'll start by saying that Zelensky made a really good point when he said that granting candidacy to Ukraine was not just a slap in the face of Russia. So not just a geopolitical decision, but applause for Ukraine in part. So recognition that Ukraine has indeed implemented a lot of institutional reforms in the last 8 years. So it has already started on this road towards meeting conditionality on issues of corruption and the rule of law. So the anti-corruption court is crucial here, and before 2022, it was moving very slowly. Its creation had to happen very painfully because there was constant pressure by civil society and by the international partners and resistance at home, and some sort of attempts to make sure you get the right people on the court. The fact that they managed to get to actually prevail, civil society and the international partners, even before the war, to me is a signal that after the war, this will be even more successful because Ukraine already has the candidate status, so it's fully in the conditionality stage. So civil society will be strengthened. But I also think that some of the perpetrators, there's also a possibility that some of these major oligarchs who have, or the smaller ones also, who have been part of these networks will actually reorient themselves towards the EU. In the sense that they know that a lot of money will be coming from the EU, and they're in a good position to start actually using this money to grow their businesses, but they will realize that this now comes with strings attached, that some transparency will be needed, tenders will have to be done properly. So I think it might actually have the effect of slowly bringing a lot of these, turning them into honest businessmen, basically. Slowly they will have to start playing by the rules. So I think the trajectory that Ukraine is already on towards reducing corruption will be only enhanced after through EU conditionality.
So, I guess I just want to push back a little bit there. We obviously have the example of Hungary, and it's not that eliminates corruption. I mean, maybe it's relative or so,
Absolutely, absolutely. And but I think the political competition is key there, because Hungary has been able to build this machine because there's no competition. So I think the risk for Ukraine would be, Zelensky becoming too powerful because he won the war, and politically too powerful. I don't know that there are necessarily signs of that happening. Even now during the war, he's getting criticized a bit and pushed. And he also wasn't so adept as a leader domestically before the war. So if political competition continues, then the Hungarian trap is not as dangerous. And it's also important to point out that the European Prosecution Office, which is this new institution tasked with monitoring corruption in the member states, is headed by this Romanian anti-corruption prosecutor who knows Eastern European corruption really well. And in fact, there were already links between NABU and her office in Romania before. So that
NABU, just explain what NABU is. I think just briefly.
The Ukrainian Anti-Corruption Directorate had very clear direct links, cooperation with the Romanian Anti-Corruption Directorate, of which this woman was the head. So she probably already has connections with anti-corruption figures in Ukraine, and will be able to, hit the ground running in exposing corruption in Ukraine in a way in which she is not able to do in Hungary.
That's great. And of course, as you mentioned with the Western Balkans, there's already the lesson of Hungary. So in a sense, just because you have one mistake, lessons are learned. So I now want to kind of shift the conversation to issues of long-term security, which both of you have written about. I think NATO has sort of been in the background of this conflict, first as a kind of, which I think most would agree in this, people who are listening, is sort of a kind of a false idea that somehow the war was started because of NATO. But there's also this, genuine issue that part of the reason why this conflict, Russia clearly wouldn't have invaded had Ukraine been a member of NATO. And so I guess the question is sort of, in the best case scenario, Ukraine pushes Russia back, but of course Russia will always remain a threat. It's not going away anytime soon. So maybe start with you, Oxana. What are your thoughts on sort of the long-term security situation and how you sort of deal with it?
Yeah, there's, just like you said, I think as long as, Russia, especially with the current regime or any sort of other kind of similar authoritarian imperialistic regime that doesn't, recognize their neighbors' rights to do their own thing, right, Ukraine would be threatened. As Zelensky talked about it, right, he talked about sort of creating Israel-type security, for Ukraine, whatever that might mean specifically, but basically clear recognition that the country would live with potential threat of invasion from a hostile neighbor for a long time, right? In that sense, this sort of talk about the security guarantees, as Maria and I have written about it in a memo recently, we don't really see alternative arrangements as quite sort of credible, in other words, right? That exactly this kind of Article 5 security guarantee collective defense that the West does not want to engage in now because of the danger of Third World War and direct conflict with Russia, right? Like, short of that, any kind of security guarantee would not quite provide the protection that Ukraine seeks, right? So I think even though, again, Zelensky has been talking about, maybe finding some arrangement whereby, say, unlike Budapest Memorandum, which was never ratified by the national parliaments, say this arrangement is ratified, right? And some, but again, it wouldn't be basically other countries coming to fight with Ukraine, which is kind of what NATO provides. And I think ultimately that would be real security for Ukraine. Given that seems unrealistic at present, what would happen? I mean, what sort of the second best options, if you want to put it this way. I think one would be absolutely critical, is that Russia is isolated and contained as long as the regime there remains what it is. So again, any kind of hopes that I think some in the West have that maybe it can go back to business as usual with Russia or some form of that, I don't think that's really realistic, or that would provide for security on the continent broadly, not just for Ukraine. So we really would be probably talking about some sort of new Cold War. For lack of a better analogy, if, say, Russian forces are pushed out of Ukraine or some kind of agreement is reached, and then, basically that's where a new Iron Curtain would fall, as long as the regime in Russia remains what it is, right? And then Ukraine would have to, constantly, as you said, live with the threat of military, basically, threat. So I don't want to take too much time. So I think this is sort of one, we can say, maybe somewhat realistic, right, and not maybe very optimistic scenario. Of course, I think we may be looking at a completely different arrangements if there is a regime change in Russia, right? Putin may still be there for a long time, but eventually he will go, or he will die, or he will be removed, right? And then I think all bets are off, right? In a way, maybe that's a little bit too early to speculate, but if, say, there is another opening and potential democratization within Russia after Putin, maybe that would be the time to really think kind of creatively about different security structures, right? And what can be done. But I think that cannot really happen without, first of all, regime change in Russia, and second of all, reckoning in the Russian society about this war, right? And about the causes of it, and the imperialism, right? And this aggressive attitude and rejection of the neighbors' rights, to sovereignty. So a lot of things would need to happen before some sort of new security architecture with Russia in it could be plausibly constructed.
Okay. So Maria, I'm going to ask you an unfair question, but that's my prerogative. I mean, of course, there are other sort of effective security arrangements outside of NATO. I mean, we have examples of course, Israel. We have, which is more controversial, but we also have South Korea, right? Which in some ways, kind of, on the face of it, would seem like a kind of plausible scenario where South Korea is not part of NATO, obviously, but with extensive Western, U.S. backing has built up a powerful military that's able to sort of withstand the North Korean challenge. I mean, is a kind of potential. I'm not saying these are necessarily mutually exclusive, but certainly is part of the solution, basically, to sort of militarize Ukraine to an extent that it doesn't rely so completely on sort of a NATO type arrangement.
Yeah, I mean, in the short term, I think that would be the best bet to help them send a clear enough signal that another invasion would be even costlier for Russia. The South Korean example would be the short-term bet, but I guess it really depends on where exactly. Let's say if hostilities end, where exactly will the border be? Because if hostilities end in a situation where Ukraine has regained all of its 91 territory, then that's one thing, but that is, highly optimistic. But if hostilities end with Russia occupying significant portions of Ukraine, then it's in some ways NATO membership is even in Russia's interest, because it would give a guarantee that Ukraine will not attack and regain these territories, because it will involve all of NATO and World War III, etc. So leaving Ukraine highly militarized and is on the one hand deterrence, but on the other hand is a possibility of Ukraine launching an attack on Russia to regain territory. So in some ways, NATO membership will be also in the interest of Russia. I mean, I don't think they recognize this,
right,
obviously.
But that of course assumes, to get there, Ukraine would have to recognize those borders, I assume, because otherwise NATO would never let it in if there are contested borders, which to me, has always been the issue why, the most obvious reason in my mind why it's obvious that NATO was never an issue is because, essentially Russia kind of effectively vetoed NATO membership in 2014 when it occupied Crimea.
Right.
Because, so so it's just, I guess it just, given, as you say, the sort of militarily, it's hard to imagine, at least right now, Ukraine regaining control of Crimea and going back to the 1991 borders. And at the same time, hard to imagine Ukraine being accepted into NATO if there are sort of internationally contested borders. I guess I have a hard time seeing how anything but the sort of South Korean scenario is at all plausible. I mean, am I wrong?
But is South Korean scenario like the US role in this, right? Like, what is the US role in South Korea? Does it have like military troops there, or is it just trade South Koreans?
I guess, that's also, yes, right, there you go. I guess I sort of see, in my mind, the sort of plausible South Korean scenario, which probably wouldn't involve US troops, you're absolutely right. So maybe that's unrealistic. But what is a sort of basically sort of an effort short of troops to really bolster Ukraine's military to such an extent that it could sort of at least make any Russian leader think twice before invading. And maybe Israel, in this sense, is more realistic. But the point being that sort of that I wonder, just I just don't see. I completely agree with you when you say that sort of anything short of NATO in terms of an international agreement is going to be not worth the paper it's written on, and NATO membership provides the most obvious solution. At the same time, I don't see a kind of plausible scenario, at least in the medium term, to NATO membership. So the only thing I do think is plausible, which is already going on right now, is making Ukraine a kick-ass militarized state, and that's
Well, that's what Zelensky has been talking about, right?
Right,
And this whole training and sort of like rearming and moving to NATO standards and all of this is happening. But I think the broader kind of context in which this discussion needs to be situated is what is actually feasible or like realistic as far as the way for the war to end. Because we are sort of assuming, or at least in simplicity seems to me in our conversation, that something whereby like Russia is not totally defeated and Ukraine is not totally defeated is going to be the outcome, right? But I don't know, like I the more I think about it, and actually the head of Ukrainian разведка, what's it called, the military intelligence, spoke about it the other day, and I think he, at least I was convinced by the way he was presenting it. It seems that it's so unlikely that Putin will settle for anything, right, other than some sort of, very close to achieving very maximalist objectives, that he would just say like, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to settle for Donbass, right? Like, or that they like pull out of Kherson or something like no, basically this war would have to go on until Russia is defeated, which may take a long time. But then I think sort of implicit in this is that if Russia is in fact defeated in Ukraine, then the regime in Russia cannot just continue like the way that it is, right? Like that sort of seems to be an assumption that maybe we shouldn't be making so readily, that they would just kind of retreat and regroup and not much has changed and Russia is still the same and Putin is still a threat. Like something pretty fundamental could actually happen. Budanov was saying this, the intelligence guy. And I think, again, this is at least a plausible hypothesis that it would be an implosion of the kind of regime that exists in Russia. They just can't really pull it off, right? And that's why he thinks the war will continue basically until one or the other side wins on the battlefield, that there won't be some sort of settlement. And by the same logic, right, Ukraine cannot really be pressured, I don't think, unless the army is completely wiped out, to just say like, okay, well, take this territory, right? Something different could be said about Crimea, that they can push the can down the road and so forth, and even potentially maybe parts of Donbass that were occupied before February, but certainly not the south, certainly not Kherson, and these other territories, right, that Ukraine would just say like, okay, let's like settle here, right? So that's sort of like, so these moving pieces. So yes, we talk about security and, NATO, some other arrangement, as you're saying, Israel, South Korea, but I think we can't really assume that we would be still dealing with the same Russia, right? And then if we are not, then it's almost like all bets are off, right?
Yeah, because it's going to happen in the long term, and we don't know what's going to happen in the long term. I absolutely agree with you that tell me if you disagree, Maria, that, I think this, from the beginning, this always seemed to have the sort of ingredients of a very long-term conflict. It's just hard to imagine either side really giving up anything, even if, certainly the contemporary regime in Putin, in Russia, it's hard to imagine them, ever sort of giving up. At the same time, Ukraine has demonstrated 10 times over to the world that it's not going to give up. And so it does.
What I'm wondering is, I absolutely agree that there's no reason for Putin to agree to just take a slightly bigger part of Donbass plus Kherson. Clearly, his maximalist goals are there to stay. But I wonder why we think that if Russia is defeated in Ukraine, the Russian regime has to implode. I can see them being defeated in Ukraine and then saying, well, we have to regroup and we have to try it again. I don't know what was the argument made about why defeat must mean the fall of the Putin regime?
Well, I think the argument, again, if I can, kind of key points, I think that were emphasized, that first of all, it really would undermine the legitimacy, right, of the regime. So Putin has made such maximalist demands and basically said that Russia must meet these goals. There is no other way, we are creating historical justice, so forth. That even with the Russian propaganda, I know not everybody agrees because some have argued that Russian propaganda can spin basically any outcome as victory. Now, if you maybe that's the case, but if you don't buy that, then this is really sort of the extent, I guess, of failure would be so profound that you can't hide this, right? And if you add to it kind of continued effect of sanctions that, again, they have, been consequential, but they haven't destroyed the economy, but, they're not presumably going to be just lifted overnight, right? The death toll that would still be added onto it because it's now already very high, but we are going to have, many more. So I think that's how this argument goes, that so many things would be going fundamentally wrong for Russia that, the saying that everything was forever until it was no more, sort of, it's not a concrete pathway that people are outlining towards the collapse of the regime, but just seems like so many outcomes would be so detrimental to the current legitimacy, narrative, economic strengths, everything basically this regime rests on, that it won't be able to stay. That's sort of how this argument broadly goes.
Yeah. Okay, I want to shift the topic a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about Zelensky and his sort of performance. At one level, I think it's been clear that Zelensky has been hugely successful at uniting both Ukrainians and the West in the war. It's striking how certainly I'm surrounded by a lot of diaspora here in Toronto who were very kind of suspicious of Zelensky and quite oftentimes quite hostile. It feels like that attitude has kind of at least completely disappeared for the moment. At the same time, I think, I have heard questions, about sort of the extent to which he was, wasn't as prepared at the end of February as he should have been or might have been, given the sort of enormous numbers of signs that were out there, massive troop movements that Putin was going to invade. So I don't know who wants to go first, but can you sort of talk about sort of Zelensky, how you kind of see Zelensky's performance in the war? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I can start. As you said, I think the way that he was able to unify both the country, right, and project image, and get support from the West, I think has been very, impressive. And the argument that he was sort of unprepared before, I'm not sure. It seems like Putin's decision was taken at the 11th hour, right? It seemed likely, but again, even in this recent Macron-Putin transcript, right, Macron was saying, I'm calling Zelensky to stand down, to not get, right? So what would he do? Get more people to panic earlier on? It sort of seems unclear exactly what could have been done, right? But that said, there were definitely many failures, not only at the local level, say like some, the shelters not being prepared and so forth, but there seems to have been really failures in the security services, right? Like this capture of Kherson, they talk about how some SBU people basically gave Russians the mining plan for that area. Like that is something that I think is really, if anything, kind of real challenge for Zelensky, because he has his childhood friend appointed as the head of SBU, right? There are a lot of questions being raised if that's really the right choice. What is happening in the security services? SBU has been involved in various economic activities that normally security service maybe shouldn't be involved in. So I think, again, it sort of goes broader to this challenge of dealing with corruption, like big umbrella of corruption, but that case, corruption has direct or potentially has direct implications for security, right? So I think this is something that definitely will be discussed for a long time. I mean, there is already talk about how there needs to be investigation, what happened in the south, and that's of course affected what happened in Mariupol. But given, the enormous challenge, this invasion from multiple fronts by a much bigger army, like who could have done much better, right? Like maybe some of these failures could have been avoided, right? But it's not that, a different leader, like say Poroshenko was in power, somebody else, I can't imagine that they would have done like fundamentally better, right? And the problem in SBU date back to the Soviet period, right? And Yanukovych period and all of these things. So I think like they really, maybe what to think about the Zelensky performance. I think one thing to look out for again going forward is this political competition that we already touched upon, right? That given the extent of his popularity, given the outlawing of the pro-Russian parties, right? Given some limitations on the Poroshenko TV channel, right? Is it possible, right? Is there danger of some sort of, consolidation of political power in Ukraine to the extent that we won't see robust political competition that we had seen before, right? I don't think that's a danger today, right? But that may be something to watch for and, be mindful of going forward, right? The elections are going to be coming up in not such a far future. Zelensky originally said he will not run for second term. Now, actually, I wouldn't be surprised if he does, and if he does, he'll probably win, right? What will be the situation in the political parties and so forth. So I think that's something that would be to watch for.
Maria?
Yeah, I'll just add that I agree with Oksana. I don't see what else he could have done to prepare. But I will point out that, in fact, if he had been more, in some ways, more paranoid and had prepared more, he would have been criticized for, hunting would-be collaborators and, constraining democratic competition. I mean, he already was criticized roundly, including by me, about how he handled the constitutional court crisis. And when he called these people, devils from political hell. But right now we have some potential evidence that indeed they were preparing to bring Yanukovych back on some made-up legal decisions. So I think he really was between a rock and a hard place in the run-up to the war, and it's easy to find things that he could have done in hindsight, but in that moment, I think there's not a lot of choice that he had.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, I think you look at World War II. It obviously began with Pearl Harbor, these major sort of errors, and I mean it's sort of inevitable. And I think I take your point, Oksana, that and Maria, that it's hard to imagine another leader doing substantially better. But I do think it is quite, if I just may speak for myself, I think it's quite remarkable the way he sort of has kind of united Ukraine. I mean, it's really kind of, that's a topic for another conversation, but really kind of taken Ukraine to a whole other kind of, I mean, it's hard to imagine Ukrainian identity remaining the same after the war. But to end, I think I want to sort of get your thoughts, since Petro, Jacyk, we're here, committed. This is not simply an analytical exercise. I mean, we've been holding almost twice weekly webinars on this conflict, and I mean, for me at least, I think this conflict is very different from anything I've analyzed. We've seen each other at other sort of Ukraine crises, whereas I used to sort of kind of pride myself in kind of distance from, that things are more complicated and, in fact, there are two sides. And whereas I feel, I think a lot of us felt this is kind of as Star Wars a conflict as you could possibly imagine. There's Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. And part of, I think, the role of our program is very much, we're not at all neutral, and we want to sort of, and part of it is sort of keeping Ukraine in the public eye. And I think just personally, what really concerns me is, looking at other conflicts like Syria, where there's a sort of moral outrage initially, and but we're kind of over time. I mean, even my wife gets sick of Ukraine, and she has to be married to me. And so, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on sort of how we kind of how we prevent Ukraine fatigue. Maybe there's no answer. I don't know.
Yeah, that's not easy. One thing I'll mention, I think that's that's important, and that may go towards preventing Ukraine fatigue, because you said, I think, the longer the conflicts drag on, kind of the less the world can keep attention on this, right? Is to really emphasize, like, what is the conflict all about, right? It's not just about Ukraine being, part of Russia or not being part of Russia. It's the kind of world that Europe, at least, right, and arguably globally, we live in. Right? Like, do we want to live in the world after, these decades after the Second World War, after all these millions of deaths, when one country can just say, and as you exactly said, this is as clear-cut, kind of unprovoked war of aggression as we get, that I'm just going to go and invade my neighbor because, 300 years ago, I think, like, we had, some tribes lived in there or whatever, right? Like, that is fundamentally a danger to like everything that normal, quote unquote, civilization stands for, right? So that's, I think, one thing that, the kind of values and the kind of world that Europeans in particular want to live with, and they used to live in with, right, and have taken for granted for decades, that is now really in danger, right? And I think, driving that point home repeatedly, that it's not just about some, random little, as they say, little is not really little country, right, that is happening, and we can kind of abstract from that. I think that was one thing. Another thing that I think goes for Ukraine is just its geography, right? It is in the heart of Europe. I mean, it is, like, human suffering is human suffering everywhere, and war is the war everywhere. But I think the fact that this war is actually happening, like, in the middle of Europe, probably goes towards helping to keep attention on this conflict. Maybe it wouldn't have been if it wasn't some, more geographically remote part of the developing world and so forth, right? And, like, certainly, kind of ironically, I think, these atrocities that Russia is committing and can be expected to commit going forward will keep the attention on, right? Like, it's not that there are some skirmishes, like, say, 2014 to 2022, that, yes, people died, but we're talking about a few people here and there, or some, like, they're bombing apartment buildings, hospitals, shopping centers. That's going to continue, right? That seems to be the method, one of the methods Russia is using. So I think that would also be keeping attention on the conflict, hopefully. So these are kind of things that I would mention.
Okay. Maria, do you want to?
Yeah, and I was just going to add that, unfortunately, I think we will not be able to escape thinking about the conflict as the global implications of the food crisis start kicking in. So it will have to be in the spotlight, because it is connected to so many global issues. It is far from a regional conflict. It is, in fact, striking at the heart of the international order, and there will be numerous implications that will constantly be in the news.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, I mean, to me, if I may answer my own question, I mean, I think part of it is kind of reframing the implications away from Russia and Putin. Because in my mind, for example, when Zelensky came, we're incredibly privileged to have Zelensky come to the University of Toronto, and he spoke about, Russia invading Canada, and which not terribly plausible as a kind of motivator, because there are only limited numbers of countries that Putin is plausibly going to invade. But I think a much more sort of salient issue has to do with, the fact that if other countries think that it's okay to invade their neighbors when they have territorial claims on their neighbors, then the whole world order literally collapses. I mean, Russia ain't the only country that has territorial claims on its neighbors. And so I think framing the conflict more in terms of that kind of broader, literally world peace, I think is sort of, potentially one way of sort of keeping things in the public mind. Anyways, thank you so much, both of you guys. It was so fun to talk to you. It's been a while. So next we have, we're kind of slowing down a little bit in the summer, but we, on July 8th, we have a session on preserving cultural heritage as a webinar. But so thank you so much. Do you want to say?
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thanks for having us. That was fun.
Okay, bye-bye.
Yep. Bye.